The 11th summit of G20 nations will be held this week in the city of Hangzhou in China. But as representatives of the world's major economies meet, economic growth continues to slow. Increasing emerging markets grapple with recession, and risk in the commodities market are on the up. And China, as incoming G20 president, will bear a significant responsibility for ensuring action is taken. But the G20 has an agenda with considerable relevance to the development of Africa. So, could positive China-Africa relations be used to leverage more support for the continent? And what are the expectations of Africa at the G20 summit? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. So how can the world's strongest economies better collaborate to increase growth? Well, world leaders will discuss new partnerships and propose solutions to some of the most pressing economic issues at the G20 summit. Before we delve into Africa's expectations of the meeting, let's take a closer look at the purpose of the body.
In 1999, 7 finance ministers, including the United States, met in Cologne, Germany, and initiated a group that would be known as a Group of 20. In response to the financial crisis in 2008, the G20 summit was created. Since then, it has added more political significance rather than being just an economic forum. Leaders from China and the US are set to have a formal meeting alongside this year's G20 summit in Hangzhou. Various regional issues are expected to be on the table. The UK vote to leave the European Union has rocked the sluggish global economy, and that puts the cooperation between the world's top 2 economies at the spotlight. The Hangzhou summit is also expected to focus on developing countries, the implementation of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the support for Africa's industrialization. Other topics will include improving global economic and financial governance and revitalizing trade and investment. This will be the first time that China hosts a global economic governance summit. It will have the best representation of developing countries in G20's history. Chinese officials said the country will join hands with others to reverse the downward trend in global trade growth. Fang Dongxuan, CCTV.
Now, while not a permanent member, Senegal is one of the African countries that will be attending the G20 as a guest. President Macky Sall, who is also the chairman of the new Partnership for African Development, NEPAD, will travel to Hangzhou in the coming days, where he said he will push Africa's agenda. Here's more of what he had to say during his recent visit to Kenya, as well as comments from Senegalese Commerce Minister about the upcoming summit.
The economy of the world. It is 20 countries, but they share more than 90% of the GDP of the world. And also from G20 we can make a plaidoyer, and we can define the African position and obtain from the international community new laws. We are talking about struggling against tax evasion. This is G20 the right place to treat this kind of question. Also the trade between Africa and other countries in the world, and many other time will be discussed with the G20, and I will be very happy to talk on the name of NEPAD, and Africans also with President of the AU will be there to bring the voice of Africa and how Africa, what we are waiting, we are not begging, we are not asking aid, we are asking for partnership. People can come invest, we are taking loans, work together in a win-win partnership. This is the way I think Africa has to move, and this is the way we see Kenya is working.
I think during this G20 summit, some concern of Africa, some needs of the continent will be looked at very seriously. For example, African countries are facing to a low GDP rate Some countries are facing to poor education. Some countries are facing also to weak industrial development. And it's why the NEPAD, the new partnership of Africa's development, was coordinated by Mr. Macky Sall, President of Senegal, in the NEPAD and in the Addis Ababa agenda taken by the African Union for 2063. We have many concerns we are taking to be addressed by the continent. The first is to have a sustainable economic development and inclusive economic development. Second, we have also a strong reduction of poverty in the continent. And all these concerns, we are sure, will be supported by the G20 summit.
But while there will be various levels of African representation at the G20 summit, South Africa is still the only African country with permanent membership in the body. But foreign investment into the country has declined, with the economy widely expected to contract this year. And our CCTV Sumitra Naidu tells us global shocks have been paired with local political tensions, adding further stress to the economy, making this year's summit more critical than ever.
The last 18 months have been rough for the South African economy. Slow Chinese demand, a commodity slump, the worst drought in decades, and sharp currency declines, all culminating in a Reserve Bank forecast of zero growth for 2016.
South Africa has run out of many of the normal growth options. It's not easy for South Africa to stimulate now through, say, a cut in interest rates, or to rely on government expenditure to drive the economy, or to expect that government can be the employer of last resort. These initiatives, I think, have been tried and they haven't led to a sustained improvement in overall growth.
Despite running a tight fiscal ship, the country's debt to GDP ratio is over 40%. The economy lost 500,000 jobs in the first half of this year, taking the unemployment rate close to 27%.
If you have unemployment because of slow growth, because sectors cannot employ more people because it just doesn't make sense, it puts the economy further into decline. So that's the number one risk. The other risk is that, look, without growth, it also impacts another, like the bigger picture. So households are also struggling in many ways, and if you don't have an income growth, then you also start to see the expenditure side of GDP remain stunted.
South Africa is running out of options to turn this economy around, despite increased efforts between government and the private sector in the last few months. Sumitra Naidu, CCTV, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, we're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, my expert guests will offer insights into Africa's expectations of the G20 summit. Do stay with us.
I think there's quite a big potential. The only African member of the BRICS group is South Africa. The only African member of G20 is South Africa. And I think China would like to just make sure that other African countries and other perspectives are included. It's quite appropriate to include the chair of the African Union, quite appropriate to include the current chair of NEPAD. And of course, Egypt is a power in the north. And so all of those countries have a role in the global economy and in the emerging economy of Africa. I think it makes sense. I think if it was China's choice, they'd have more African countries there. But these are representative. It's good.
That was Phyllis Johnson, founding director at the Southern African Research and Documentation Center, speaking of the significance of African representation at the G20 summit. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to offer more insights into Africa's expectations ahead of the meeting in Hangzhou, I have expert guests standing by. In Johannesburg, Asmita Pashutam. She's a researcher in the Economic Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. In Beijing, current affairs commentator Victor Gao. In London, Alex Vines is the head of the Africa program at Chatham House. And with me in Nairobi, consultant economist David Awira. To you all, thank you very much for joining us in this conversation. Let me start off with you, Asmita Pashutam. China has outlined several priorities for the G20 summit upcoming, boosting potential growth, improving global governance, promoting trade and investment, and implementing the UN's 2030 development agenda. From your perspectives, though, for Africa, what are the objectives that are of a priority, that are of focus here for Africa?
Well, I think that the G20 obviously is one of the largest development agenda-setting forums in some respects. And so when you look at the players, you look at the leaders that are present at this sort of function, you can see that it's very prominent, very powerful leaders in the world. And I think that what they can do and what they choose to do can greatly influence how the development agenda is actually implemented on the African continent. So I think one of the things that that would be useful to see that comes out of the G20 meeting this year is really driving forward some of the key development issues that have been discussed in prior meetings, but that should be followed through at this meeting. Issues such as infrastructure financing on the continent, regional integration, remittances, those sorts of things.
Right. Victor Gao, to you, what are China's objectives here?
Well, this year's Hangzhou G20 summit meeting, which will start 2 days from today, will be very important, mainly because a global economy is still not yet completely out of the woods. The developed countries' economy, especially in Europe, for example, are still relatively weak, and growth in the United States is not sustainable at present. Japan is still very much in the downward trend, and the Chinese economy, even though growth rate is expected at 6.5% or so, is also suffering great losses in terms of the growth rate. And therefore, I think at the G20 in Hangzhou, the global leaders need to gather and compare notes and focus on the inclusive development, innovative development, interconnected development, infrastructure, try to achieve sustainable development. And this will create, hopefully, a consensus view for the G20, but also way beyond the framework of G20. And all the countries in the world will see the future trend in the world clearer, and with greater guidance going forward.
Alex Vines, for the rest of the world, what are they hoping will be the objectives, will be the outcomes of the G20 in China?
Well, for the members of the G20, it is an important forum to discuss slow economic global growth and how to get more inclusive growth because the world's economies are so interconnected. In terms of Africa, I have my doubts that it will be a very prominent area of discussion at all in this summit. The only country that will really benefit from the conversations is South Africa, which is sending a delegation. Obviously, they're part of the G20. They're also going to be having meetings with the business 20 business leaders who are around the summit. And then South Africa is going on to attend a big investment conference a few days after the G20 summit in China. So it'll be South Africa, in terms of Africa, I think, in the short term, that has the most to gain from this summit.
Right, South Africa is the only country that will gain from this summit. What about the other African countries that have been invited? Senegal, Chad, Egypt are some of the other African countries that will be attending the G20.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that at this point, whatever business deals or trade deals that are concluded at the G20 have a big impact on the rest of Africa, even though they are not participating at the summit. And so the expectation, as has been previously, is that the G20 leaders will see, their special mandate in terms of making whatever arrangements that they are making as inclusive as possible, so that they also bear in mind the kind of impact that has on the rest of the continent, for which they is a big trading partner for them.
Right, so I'll come to you though, Ashmita, because at this point, Alex Vine's view is that only South Africa may likely benefit from the G20. Though, what is Africa's agenda if Africa has an agenda at all?
Well, I think the important thing is that, firstly, South Africa doesn't have an explicit mandate from other African countries to speak on behalf of the African continent or on behalf of the African agenda. So there isn't an explicit mandate, but you know, the line, the greyness is there. So I think there is an implicit understanding that South Africa should be putting forward some of the key issues that are facing the African continent. And I think that South Africa's role in this respect has always been to sort of, you know, juggle between the two. It comes from, so one of the things that South Africa has always been cautious about is, you know, how does it position itself in relation to the global south, in relation to its relations with other African countries, in relations to some of its northern partners. And I think that there has been an increased representation in the sense that there are, for example, the AU chair or the NEPAD chair that gets invited. But the question then is, how much is the African community doing at large to really put forward an African agenda, and is there really an effort being made to put forward a unified voice, or to put together, to put forward an agenda that really speaks to Africa's developmental concerns? And there has been fragmentation on this front, I think, in recent summits.
Does Africa, though, David, does Africa have a unified voice when it comes to the G20, or is Africa, the African Union, under Chad, of course, here, and Egypt and the other countries, South Africa, are they going with a unified voice? Is there a unified agenda for Africa?
I think in the sense that this has not been sort of discussed and moved forward. And so the question to me, to my mind, is, are Africa's problems known with regards to the G20? I think the answer to that would be yes. We know that G20 nations, you know, if you look at, for instance, trade in agriculture, G20 nations have the highest tariffs against, you know, imports of agricultural products from Africa. And, you know, peak tariffs are at something at about 35%. When you look at an issue such as tariff escalation facing the agricultural sector, again, G20 nations have, you know, rates at about 9%. And so in terms of the challenges that Africa faces, African economy faces, I think those are quite well known and a lot has been written about them. But in terms of Africa going forward with a common strategy, I think that is what has been lacking.
Victor, China has the presidency of the G20, and Beijing has been wanting a greater role for Africa and the developing world in the G20. Is China's presidency going to help Africa's agenda at all?
Well, first of all, Africa is very littly represented at G20, with South Africa as the only member. On the other hand, Africa has great potential, and hopefully eventually when G20 gets enlarged, several other major African nations, including Egypt and Nigeria, probably could be considered for the enlargement of G20 several years from now. As far as China is concerned, since G20 is mostly focused on global economic, trade and financial matters, without including African countries, the inclusiveness of G20 will not be that significant. So definitely China will promote to reflect on the interests of the African countries as much as possible, while giving due consideration to the specific nature of G20. That is the 20 largest economies in the world. Each has its own agenda, each has its own aspiration, and each wants to get connected with the rest of the G20 and promoting their own agenda. Eventually, by the end of the G20 sessions, there will be great